the idea of this talk today with referring to a historical moment. Almost exactly 500 years ago, in the year 1521, a very famous situation happened. Um, it was Martin Luther in April 1521 who stood in front of the Kaiser and a lot of bishops in the city of Worms in Germany, and he was asked to um, yeah, rebuke his writings, and he didn't. It is a debate if the sentence "Here I stand and I will not change my mind" is actually historical, but anyway, it was a moment that is one of those very significant moments in the history of the Reformation. The Reformation itself is something that happened here in Europe, and it was one of those moments which didn't only shape our continent, but it had an impact on Christianity all over the world until today. Um, Today, 500 years later, the center of Christianity is not in Europe anymore. It is in other continents like Asia, Africa. That's where the majority of Christians is today. Um, the, the the situation of the church in Europe is an interesting one. And yeah, our conversation today is there still something that's happening in Europe that we can learn, that the world can benefit maybe from? Not that we're thinking we have all the questions, the answers to the questions, but is there something that we're actually learning here? And this is my question. Tim, maybe Tim Keller. We have two Tims today. There's maybe you as someone who is not the European on this call. What is your perspective on this idea?
Yeah, I think. Thank you, Stephan. I think the reason why this is an important subject, what can the rest of the world learn from Europe, is because Europe is pretty deeply secular. Secularism is a situation in which people don't have much of a sense of transcendence, the sacred. They tend to be more relativistic in their morals. They don't have much of an understanding of sin. They certainly, in many cases, have no concept of God or the supernatural. In most of the rest of the world, in traditional non-secular cultures, when you start to do evangelism, you can work with that. You can work with some givens that they do have a sense of sin, and they do have a sense that there's something like God or beyond. You can't do that with secular people. Now, even though Europe is secular, and you would say, oh, Africa, India, they're not secular, but if you go into the biggest cities, if you go into Mumbai, you'll very often find, for example, you might say the professionals, or you might call them the elites, very much more secular than the rest of India. Same thing would be true in Latin America. Same thing would be true even in Africa. And therefore, the kind of European style secularism is actually spreading through the academy, through the media, social media in particular. And therefore, we really can't say, well, what's that? Europeans, Europeans are strange, and the rest of us, we believe in God and we're more moral. No. So I think what the people on the front line of European mission, church leaders and so on, they really will be able to talk to the rest of us about how do you reach people like this who are, I think, over the next at least 20 or 30 years will be continuing to increase in the rest of the world. So that's why I'm interested to hear from René and Tim and Stephan, and I'll weigh in as time goes on. And at the end, some things I would learn as a North American, but that I hope frames the question a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, René and Tim, does it feel like that being a church leader in Europe, or what is the insight from that?
I would say that yes, I think it is relevant what Tim Keller just said, because I think that the nature of the challenge, first of all, right, because it's spreading to other places, which is the question how to do ministry in a secularized society, reaching people who did not have a religious upbringing at all, or had a mix of positive or negative experiences with church. At least in our case in Rome, is very few people have gotten to know a Protestant church before getting in contact with us. So I think other approaches which might work maybe in other contexts, for example, like the church planting way of trying to start a cool church with great worship and social media, it helps us reach people who did have some contact with the Protestant church in the past, but those are not in large number. I think it forces us to think about those who did not have that kind of experience in the past, and focus on those who did not believe. and think about not only the gathered church on Sunday, but also the scattered, the distributed church beyond Sundays and church buildings and ordained ministry. How can we relate to the city? How can we serve the city, be a positive presence, and be outward focused and missional, and not just think about our own meetings, right? Mostly, and then don't reach those outside it.
If I can add something to that, I think it's not only a Christian phenomenon. So it's true, but it's even broader than that. I had a good conversation last week with a young Amsterdam guy, I think 32 or 33, who stems originally from Western Africa. His family moved to Amsterdam. It's a traditional Muslim background, but he's very talented, very well educated, has his own company. And he says to me, I think I'm a believer, but I do not share anything that my parents handed over to me in terms of belief or morals. But I do not myself see myself as an unbeliever or an immoral person, although my parents think I am. So there is the same phenomenon in a non-Christian perspective. So I think it really has to do with academy, but also with the city as a place of a challenge for people to think for themselves and to create their own biographies and worldviews.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, is the urbanization adding to this process somehow? And how can we I mean, City is mainly focusing on working with urban people. Is that what do we learn in cities, how to share the gospel to these people? But is urbanization, so living in cities, kind of accelerating that process?
I'll say it does, because it puts you in contact with people who are very different from you, right? Maybe in the village, like most people, or in a small town, most people may think alike, or maybe a foreigner may be an unusual sight. But in the city, you see people from all over the place, and the way people dress, maybe from other religions or nationalities. It forces you to kind of think about what you believe in relation to others, and also think about, well, even if you do believe, it's one option among many. So it makes the way we believe, it's also more provisional, less certain, and more like kind of we ask ourselves, right, is this right? Or we're less sure. I think it introduces this kind of a pluralistic society, this context, which day to day makes you think those questions.
Yeah, I would certainly agree that this actually this has always been the case. It's cities or places, as René said, where people are brought together from different cultures, and that actually weakens all the cultures to some degree. A friend of mine, James Davison Hunter, who's a sociologist, when he lectures on culture, he says that a culture is most powerful when it's invisible, and it's invisible when there are many things that the culture has taught you are unimaginable. You couldn't even imagine doing it. You couldn't imagine anybody does it. And therefore, it doesn't even seem like culture. It's just the way things are. When you go into a city, your neighbor of a different culture is actually doing the very thing that your culture taught you is unimaginable. And then that person seems like they're not exploding, or their head's not exploding. They're living. And what that does is it makes your culture visible to you. And when your culture gets more visible, it gets more contestable or questionable. And therefore, it has always been the case that culture weakens in the city. And for Christian, so what that does mean is a person who becomes a Christian in the rural area of China, when he or she moves to the city, that person is going to need a special kind of support to keep them, growing as a Christian. But the good news for evangelists is that non-Christians, when they come into the city, are also more open to change. They always have been. And therefore, people who've never thought about Christianity before, even Christianity can become imaginable. Yeah. So on the one hand, I would say, frankly, I would call it a tie. Urban is both a big disadvantage and a big advantage for the Christian evangelist.
Tim Vreugdenhil, you live in one of those European, very secular, very post-Christian cities of Europe, in Amsterdam. it's probably a super prototype of what that would be. What do you think the world could learn from what we, and you do ministry there, what do you think the world can learn from some of the things we've been talking about, in terms of how do we share the gospel into a context like that?
Well, I think the first thing the world can learn from my city, from Amsterdam, is that if you take Christianity out of the city, the result is not a very bad and totally immoral city. So, of course, some people have the idea that because of the drug stories and the prostitution thing and so on, but I'm surrounded by well-educated, very moral, very intelligent, very soul-searching people. I remember my theological studies were in the 90s of the 20th century, so 25 years ago, and that our seminary was not in a big city. And I oversimplify a little bit, but actually we were educated for a world in which you have either Christians or materialistic, not God-fearing people. And I think the big lesson is, even in a secular society, so many people are asking very good questions and take very interesting decisions, sometimes brave decisions, and that's a phenomenon that we should study instead of cherishing our own pictures of how a secular world looks like. So my testimony from a very secular city is, it's not paradise here, of course, but it's the society works even without Christianity, and that's the starting point.
How's that in Rome? What would people could learn from Christianity? And I mean, Rome definitely has a history that gives a nuance to that question, but what is it from Rome?
Yeah, good question, Stephan. Just before saying talk about Rome, I was just listening to Tim. I think it's very interesting to recognize that, and I think if we say something like that to people who don't believe, I think it looks like we're weakening our position in recognizing other people's good sides, but actually it strengthens, right? Because this is, people are appreciating even the way secular people maybe live, and maybe with wisdom and courage, and so that's interesting. So in Rome, I would say it is a less secular place than Northern Europe. Most people here, I would say, like, yeah, I believe in God. I don't really think about it, but at least if you ask, that's the usual answer. So it is secular, but it is a kind of a Catholic structure of thought that remains. For example, if someone starts to ask questions, spiritual questions, and get interested in spiritual matters, what they usually think about is a Christian frame, like a God, Jesus is the Son of God, the Trinity, sin, the church. It has some kind of, those things are not fully erased yet. But it does raise an opposite question, is that it raises a big question of the church, right? The church becomes the big obstacle. People thinking, having negative experiences or negative image with it. And so how can you be both a different church, which is Christian, but it's not Catholic? That's kind of the tension and the challenge.
Stephan, this is an outsider's view, and this is maybe not, we have so little time, maybe I shouldn't be mentioning this, but my outsider's view is that the Mediterranean world, as it were, and that means what we would call a Catholic or Eastern European, the Orthodox and the church, the nations that had Orthodox and Catholic backgrounds, basically the church grew there. So I mean, what the Bible shows you, the church grew in these lands, and they came from the bottom up until Constantine or places like emperors had to acknowledge that Christianity was growing, and they began to recognize it. But in northern and Western Europe, very often it was a top-down. The monarch would when the King of Northumberland in England converted, then everybody else automatically got baptized. And there are historians that actually say, as a result of that, Christianity was thinner in Northern and Western Europe. And it just did not permeate. The cultural memory is going away faster than it is in Eastern and Southern Europe. As a Protestant, I don't like to hear that, but there seems to be some merit to it. And that's the reason why René would say, I don't, the average person I talk to in Rome, they'll say, yeah, I believe in God. And maybe the average person in Amsterdam would say, I don't, or at least certainly a higher percentage. And I do. And of course, because I'm the product of Protestant and Reform, I'm the product of the Netherlands and all that. I don't like to think about that, but I do think that there may be some truth to that. Yeah, I'm not sure that takes us very far, but it does show that Europe is not in any way a unified mission field where let's just come up with a gospel presentation we can use in Europe. Very important.
Yeah, and for me, that what you just said at the end is one of the most biggest learnings, is that, this time of when a lot of people in the Christian world, different denominations would say, well, sharing the gospel is basically something you can teach to someone in a course in a Saturday afternoon. And then that person knows this 5-minute version of whatever that is. And, it has 3 steps or 5 points or 7 units, whatever. And then you just learn it and you just share it on the train with your neighbor, on the street. And that's evangelism. And it is almost like a technology or technique that you use to have an effect on the other person. I think that's that view of the gospel, which was used a lot in Europe, is too small. I don't think it ever really produced something really good, but that idea that could work is so over that we're seeing it failing so much that the church in Europe is really thinking deeper about, what does sharing the gospel mean, and understanding more that it's, just not just one question in life. It's not just one answer to one question in life. It's the answer to all questions in life. And it is something we need to get deeper into ourselves, into our communities, and then share with others. And that is one of it's not totally new to me, but I think this idea that helping people to share the gospel is not just something I teach them in a course in 2 hours, and then they can just use it everywhere. I think that's a very good learning experience from Europe. That I don't know if the world needs that insight, but it's at least something that we here in Europe would say is a big learning. Yeah, sometimes you learn through crisis, right? That's one of the strongest ways to learn. Best way to change is to see that it fails, and then you really need to rethink. And that's, I think, where Europe is in this phase. Yeah.
But maybe here's another story to share. I think what could be helpful for other parts of the world. We live in a society here. I live in an Amsterdam society where people are indeed too skeptic or too relativistic to believe that there are answers to difficult questions. So yes, there is deep skepticism about that such answers do exist. Nevertheless, people are very hungry for inspiration, especially in the form of good stories. So I can make use of the biblical stories all the time, and there's a sort of openness and eagerness to learn what is mentioned there. And I think in a certain way that brings us back to the days of Jesus, where at least Jesus chose a ministry of not giving direct answers to all sorts of questions. He was criticized for that. Be more clearer now and then. But he shared stories all the time, and in that way of doing ministry, to me it's very helpful to find my own part of ministry and try to share the stories as good as I can, and also very carefully listen to the responses of my audience to these stories. So it's a somewhat different way of theology. Then there is a question, what's the answer? So the typical catechism style. For every question there is a good story, and then there is a lesson to learn.
So is that like in Europe we learn that being a church that tries to be the organization that has all the right answers versus it is a group of people that can give witness about something that they experience and stories that they can refer to?
Yeah, maybe you can even summarize it in a slogan. I think we do not have all the right answers as a church, but we certainly do have the best stories. That's what I like to say, and then I refer to the biblical stories or the best stories to share. And even my atheist friends, most of the time, they agree with that.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left for our conversation. Just let me remind all our people who watch this today that there is an opportunity to ask questions. So if you want to ask a question to my guests today, please put them in the chat and I will have an opportunity to ask them in a few minutes. Maybe let me turn to you, Tim Keller, as the outsider, the one that is not from Europe. I mean, you're in a very European-facing city in New York. Still, you're not European in your passport. What is something that someone from not Europe could learn from Europe?
Well, I'd rather, yes, I have plenty, and I think all I have to do is summarize. I've been taking notes here from what René and Tim has just said. And so here's 6 things, okay? All of which have been mentioned even briefly, okay? That's more than you thought, right, Stephan? I see you.
That's good.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the one is, it went by very quickly, but René pointed out that the American way of planning churches is to plant a worship service, not a church. And then what you do is you plant some great sort of a service that is a great show, as it were, great music and all that sort of thing. The only way that really grows is you suck already Christians out of other churches. Yeah. In a place like Rome, if you're trying to grow more, that's fatal, because the churches are small. And if René puts on this great show and maybe better than anybody else, better music, better preaching, you just empty all the other relatively small churches comes to you. That's just not the best at all. And so you really have to learn how to plant churches evangelistically, where you're starting as a pioneer and you don't see big growth right away. And there has to be, on the part of the people who are sponsoring new church planting, that you want it to be evangelistic, then you have to be patient. I mean, in other words, the givers have to be patient. There's pressure on the church planter to show numbers. And the fastest way to show numbers is just to basically steal sheep from other churches. Second thing, also, René went very quickly. Most people think that you're either a progressive, outward-looking person who's trying to help society, or else you're one of these conservative little insular churches that are kind of negative about society. And when you see an orthodox, doctrinally orthodox, believing Protestant church that cares about the city, that really is out there helping the city, that occupies a kind of space that most people don't have in their minds. They think you're either outward focused, helping people, or you're a pie in the sky by and by. I'm sorry, I don't know how that comes across for those of you who aren't English speakers. It's it just much more otherworldly and insular. And to create the kind of church that we would talk about here in City to City, it breaks the categories of liberal conservative in most people's minds, and it makes them a little more open to what you're saying. Europeans have learned that. Number 3, basically what Tim was talking about is Reformed Christians, at least, and I'm not suggesting everybody here has to be a Reformed Christian, we believe in something called common grace. We also believe in what Peter Leithart has called middle grace, which is there is an enormous cultural memory in Europe of the ideas of human rights and of justice and compassion for the poor and those things. These are ideas that actually Tom Holland recently has written a book, an English book called Dominion. It's got different subtitles depending on where it's published, but it's a history of how almost all modern secular values of human rights and care for the poor are Christian ideas, or they're from the Hebrew Bible, and they were spread out through Christianity. And what that means is that you really do have to listen, because when I say middle grace, it means the memory of Christian times, and common grace is just the fact that God does give everybody gifts of wisdom. And René is right in saying that if you, instead of just challenging everything that the non-Christian believes, if you're willing to affirm them, not only does that open doors, but sometimes you can use what you're affirming to challenge them. Because you can say, well, if you really do believe in every human being is equal, why do you not believe this? In other words, the best way to challenge someone is on the basis of their own beliefs. And that only happens if you're able to really affirm them. I guess the last thing I would say, well, there's 6 things, I'll try to be real fast. Tim is right in saying that people are just too complicated to have a single, Stephan's already made this point. A Hindu who still is with his family in London, but he's gone to Oxford. He's been partly secularized, but at the same time, because he wants to be family, he still attends the temple. Same thing with a Muslim who's gone to Cambridge and was raised in Britain and now stays going to the mosque, but there's something that's changed. That person is still more traditional and yet secularized, and that's not the same thing as an Anglo blue collar working class person who's much further away from Christianity. There's just not one way to do it. Here, the other thing about story, and I really just end with this. Flannery O'Connor, who was a Catholic short story writer, an American. One time somebody asked her about one of her famous short stories, could you put it in a nutshell? Could you just tell me what the story actually is about? Just put it in a nutshell. And she said, if I could have put it in a nutshell, I wouldn't have had to write the story. And what she meant was that stories have an excess of meaning. There almost always is a lesson. In fact, you really don't read well without saying, here's what the story is about. On the other hand, there's always more meaning in it than you could ever get into a bullet point statement. And I do think that on the one hand, Christianity has to be careful. We have to say there are truths. These stories are giving you truths. But when you tell a story, it makes the truth much more real to people because it's helping them evoke sense experiences of their own. And it actually very often they'll find more in the story than you even meant to put there. So I actually do think the idea of evangelizing through stories, giving people a lot of credit for what they do believe, which is good and right, making sure that we don't try to, and by the way, here's the last thing I would say, Stephan, the whole idea that you have to put the gospel into an outline that you can teach people, that's really an American thing. We spread it around the world. That's just the way Americans are. And they're still going to want to do that. Yeah. So we Americans have to say, let's be nice to the rest of the world and not keep trying to come up with, we're entrepreneurs. We want to do a 3-step thing that we can scale. That's how everybody in America makes their money. They find something very, very simple that really sells and they scale it to everywhere because they feel like it's the magic bullet. And it is, we imposed that on European Christianity about 60 or 70 years ago. It's not working anymore, and it increasingly will not work in North America and other places as well. Done.
Yeah, we see the beauty of that American behavior in the fast food restaurants all over Europe.
Yes, that's right. Well, it does make money, but gospel's not fast food.
Yeah, cool. Any last thoughts of René and Tim, and then we're going to turn to the questions. Anything you want to maybe a thought that you in reflection to what Tim said?
Yeah, I would just add what was just said about the importance of stories. I think that's very much true. Like Jesus told parables, which are the things we remember best, like the prodigal son and the Samaritan woman and the Good Samaritan and all that. So I think this is very powerful. We've seen also the power of the arts, or even if you do like concerts, or art festivals, or dramas or things like that, and dialogues. I think if we as Tim was mentioning, like if we recognize good points the other people do, we've invited people from other religions to do like debates or dialogues with us, and it was very interesting for people to see like 2 points of view alongside each other and interacting and recognizing each other's good points and differences. So I think it was stimulating as well.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you, Tim, on your last point, that the fact that we use a lot of stories doesn't mean that we doesn't say that there are truths. But I think here's a lot of work to do, especially for us as European theologians. I mean this, a lot of biblical stories have theistic references or references to the incarnation. And exactly these concepts are very hard to understand for non-Christian people. It doesn't resonate with their system. You can talk 20 times about Jesus is a God taking flesh and coming to the earth, but it's very hard, even if they try their best to get it. Most of the time they do not seem to grasp it. So this is one of the things that I'm thinking of all the time. What could be done better? Yesterday I used the example in a short sermon that I said Jesus in the theology of Paul, Jesus is the major of the whole creation, and also the project developer of a new earth. And then then there is some connection with a non-Christian audience. They say, "Oh, I think I understand what you mean." But it's not, he's the head of the cosmos or the typical things that we were trained for in our religious education and ministry. So this is one of my desires, that we should be better in these respects over the years, and maybe share our insights with other parts of the world, as we try to do right now.
Right. Okay, thank you for this conversation so far. We have a few minutes left to answer a few questions, and I will give the first one to Tim Vreugdenhil. You already kind of began to answer it in your last comment. And this one is, doesn't the, I think it's referring to the use of stories, doesn't that open the door to saying that all truth is relative if the church doesn't have the answer over good stories? Is that really what we want to convey people? So it's kind of questioning, is there a tension towards, having the real truth and only telling stories? You already referred a little bit to it.
So a very simple answer. From my personal experience, I almost never hear good stories from a Muslim background or from a Hindu background. That doesn't mean that they are not there. But as a Christian manager and a Christian theologian, it's my task to share the biblical stories that I know about, that I believe in. And everybody's invited to bring other stories, to bring them lay them on the table. But my usual experience is that people are very grateful for the sort of story you choose for this day or this moment, and then they very much like to reflect on that. So this most of the time, this is not in a relativistic template, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. One question here is, I think, towards something you, Tim Keller, said. That's how have people responded when you affirm their goodness or affirm something that they say, but then challenge them in their beliefs? And maybe you can explain a little bit more deeply what that idea is.
Well, it's a lot easier to challenge somebody as being inconsistent with their own beliefs than it is to say, I'm completely right and you're completely wrong. So when you come in, so for example, there's a place where C.S. Lewis says, when someone says, I don't believe in an angry God, I believe in a loving God. I don't believe in a God who gets angry and wrathful. I believe in a loving God. So he says, you believe in a loving God? So do I. But I believe in, how does an artist love his work if someone is defacing it? How does a parent love his daughter when she's becoming an alcoholic? In other words, he says, people who are really, really loving do get angry. In fact, if they didn't get angry when the thing they love is jeopardized, they wouldn't really be loving, they'd be indifferent. So he says, if you believe in a loving God, I do too, but then you have to believe in a God who gets angry. So what he's doing is not just saying, you have this wimpy God of love and I have the biblical God of holiness. No, you're coming in and you're affirming them, and maybe you would take longer than I just did. Paul does this, by the way, in Acts 17. He quotes the philosophers and he quotes the poets, and he says, you believe this? Right. But now, if you believe this, how could you believe in idolatry? And if you believe God created everything, how could you get him into a temple? And so that's just, Aristotle actually says that the main way to persuade somebody is to not just say, I'm all right and you're all wrong, but you come in, affirm something, and then in a sense, use it against them, but in a gentle way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Another question is, what would you say are the roots of the European pessimism, which is part of the skeptical idea? And what are some possible helpful ways to respond?
Interesting question.
Mhm.
I'm in the midst of the preparation of a talk, which I will give during the conference that we have at City Europe within 2 weeks from now, and I'll focus on 3 historic events: the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, and the French Revolution of 1789, and the First World War. And I think these are are 3 of the explanations why Europeans tend to have a very pessimistic view on the course of history and all this stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
It makes sense to me. I mean,
In our
René.
case, yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, René.
No, I was just saying, like on the hope side, I agree with the 3 events. Yeah, very much. In our case, I've seen like how it is a good combination when we have ministries where Europeans collaborate with non-Europeans, because some do know well the context, and the others bring a fresh perspective and a sense of joy and hope, which sometimes lacks, right? So I think it is a good combination in terms of even churches which start and then start to be contagious, and other churches start believing, oh, maybe we can do something too and grow and reach people as well. So I think it, also this Europeans tend to be more pessimistic, I think, compared to people in other parts of the world. I say, as people who came from Brazil, someone who came from Brazil, but then this mix can work very well.
That's all I was going to say, and that is because I know René's from Brazil, working in Europe. That I do think New World Christians do have something to offer the Europeans, and usually it is more optimism and more hope. Whereas we can learn from the Europeans in many ways, but I still think, in spite of the fact that we can overdo it, Americans can say, here's your 3-step how to become a Christian. Nevertheless, I do think that the New World was a bigger place. We had all this space. People just, there's no doubt that the size of the New World compared to what you have in Europe was actually a social structural had a social structural impact on our temperament, that we're just more willing to start new things and begin new things and start churches and start universities and start things, because there's always more territory to move to for many years. Now that's stopping now, but we had a longer period of time. So we can probably, you might say, for our older brothers, I don't mean older brothers in the prodigal son sense, but our older European church brothers, we can sometimes, I think, come along and be optimistic and help them. And actually, René has brought the New World optimism to Rome. I saw that years ago, and I said, this is right. This is good.
Yeah. So giving one of my answers to people who are very skeptic, and I think the European skepticism is born out of kind of a rebuke of a church that was super controlling about everything. Yes. So the Enlightenment is, in some sense, a pushback to a church that was holding on to truth that were, not true anymore, and even, about the world, about the cosmos and things like that, and basically being skeptical about something that you were not allowed to be skeptic because the church said, if you disagree, you're against God. So in some sense, that is the European skepticism, with its roots in the Enlightenment, is somehow a disagreement to the religious power or the religious, world. And I would say to people, so that thought really helped a lot of my non-Christian friends. And I said, well, if you're that skeptical towards, church, towards Christian, religion, towards basically the religion that dominated, even in an unhealthy way, for a long time Europe, you would really like Jesus. Because there is no other person in the whole world ever was so skeptical against the religious leaders of his age than Jesus. You would actually like to read him. So you should. It's the Gospels are a story of a man who, in many ways, challenged and disagreed and was very skeptical towards the people who were the religious leaders of his age. You should read him, because he was that guy. You would really be in good company with him if you.
No, that's brilliant.
Today.
Jesus. Yeah.
that creates an interest, of someone who is skeptical to identify with Jesus as a person, and just make them curious about I mean, somehow, and then you're almost at the gospel. Somehow, the reason why they crucified him was because he was agreeing and skeptical, and that you're almost at the cross in that point. So that's often created a lot of curiosity in people that I answer to.
I would actually suggest to Tim that you might want to put in the idea of the state church. The real reason I think that the Enlightenment got started was because after the Reformation, all those religious wars, because the Europeans believed that every country had to have a single state church, a single tradition. And we are we going to be Lutheran, Reformed, Catholic? What are we going to be? And that means that not only did you have the violence, because you had to fight a war to decide things like that, but then it also did create a skepticism because the state church was in bed with power. In 1850, you still couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge if you were a Baptist. You had to be a member of the Church of England. You couldn't even go to Oxford or Cambridge, which basically excluded you from the upper reaches of power. And so that is not the mistake at this point we've made in the rest of the world. And so you might want to say, yeah, that might be another reason why there's been a lot of pessimism, that the church, they feel like if you give the church an inch, it'll take a mile, we would say in America. If you give it a little bit, it's going to want to get back in charge, and we can't let that happen. And I think that's a fair, frankly, it's a fair critique. I mean, it's a place where the church did not live up to its own critique of religion, which Stephan just said you have in the mouth of Jesus. So that might be something you might want to add. I don't know, not to tell you how to do your thing.
All right, friends, we're done with our time of our conversation today. So let me say,
just getting going, Stephan.
I know. And if you want more of this, Tim already included a perfect commercial for our upcoming conference. Thank you very much, Tim. I want to remind it again. So if you want more of this conversation, Tim and René and other European leaders will be contributing to our conference, which there will be talks, there will be conversations. There's a whole virtual world with a lot of opportunities to talk and interact. So please find it out at our website. The conference is on May 25th to 27th. You can get to it virtually, so you can join just from home or with a group of people, whatever. You will find it out. But a big invitation from all of us to join the City Europe conference in a couple of weeks and continue this conversation, because this topic is basically the main theme of the conference. So thank you very much, Tim and René, for your insights today, and thank you for taking time. I hope this was inspiring for you and helpful, and it's maybe stimulated some thoughts. If you want to get in touch with us, can send us an email or something at our website, or reach out to us. We're happy to continue the conversation in another way. Thank you very much, my guests. Thank you, everyone, for watching this. And I hope you will have a blessed evening. And I hope that you will find joy in what we're trying to talk about here, in sharing the gospel with people all over Europe. Thank you very much. Goodbye.